I had owned the mountain house for exactly 6 days when I heard someone rattling the gate at midnight. The sound carried sharp through the cold night air, a metallic clatter that jolted me out of the half-dream state I was in. At first I thought it might be a bear, because the realtor had been so eager to remind me this was bear country. But then I heard it again, deliberate, impatient, human hands shaking the iron bars. When I peeked through the curtains, a woman in slippers and a floral robe stood outside the locked gate, waving a flashlight like a lightsaber and yelling that she needed to get in immediately. That was the night I met Karen, and I should have known then that buying this house meant I wasn't just inheriting 4 walls and a leaky roof. I was walking straight into a war. The house had looked like a bargain, perched on the ridge with fog curling around it every morning like something out of a Gothic novel. The porch leaned a little, the paint peeled in sheets, and the gutters sagged, but I didn't care. I wanted a project, something to throw myself into. The realtor called it rustic charm. My bank account called it the only thing you can afford without selling organs. I called it freedom. Until Karen appeared. The first time I saw her was actually a couple days before the midnight incident. I had been unloading lumber from the truck when she marched up the driveway like she owned the place. She introduced herself in the same tone a cop uses to ask for your license and registration. She said she was the HOA vice president, and then immediately added that she was basically the president, since Phil doesn't have the backbone for leadership. I hadn't even figured out where the water shut-off valve was, and this stranger was lecturing me about the exact shade of beige my future siding should be painted. I thought she was just nosy. Every neighborhood has one. She told me my truck was parked 3 inches over the approved parking boundary, and that I would need to submit a landscaping plan by the end of the month. I smiled politely, nodded, and then went back to pretending my house didn't reek of mildew. She stood there longer than necessary, like she was waiting for me to flinch. Eventually she left, muttering something about newcomers thinking they're special. I thought that was the end of it. The night at the gate proved otherwise. She had a clipboard tucked under one arm and was shouting that her parents were arriving, and that the HOA had designated my driveway as the emergency guest drop-off area. I opened the window just enough to ask why she thought it was acceptable to rattle someone else's gate after dark. She said it was in the bylaws, and that if I didn't comply I could face fines. When I asked to see the bylaws, she waved her clipboard like it was the Declaration of Independence. I locked the window and went back to bed. The rattling continued for another 10 minutes before she stormed off, swearing she would bring this up in the next meeting. In the daylight, the house seemed less haunted and more comical. The roof had a hole big enough to see stars through, and the basement stairs creaked like they were auditioning for a horror movie. Still, I loved it. The land was wide, the air sharp with pine, and when the fog cleared, you could see the valley stretch for miles. Every hammer swing felt like claiming the space as my own. Except whenever I looked toward the road, I half expected to see Karen's floral robe flapping in the breeze. 2 days later, I found a note taped to my mailbox. It wasn't signed, but it smelled like the perfume cloud that trailed after Karen. It read, "Please leave gate unlocked for family arrivals. Non-compliance will be noted." I laughed so hard I nearly stapled my thumb when working on the porch railing. Family arrivals? This wasn't a hotel. That week, I learned more about the HOA than I ever wanted. The bylaws weren't printed anywhere publicly. They seemed to exist entirely inside Karen's head, summoned at her convenience. The neighbors hinted at her antics when I stopped to chat at the gas station. One older guy said she once fined him for having a wind chime that caused auditory pollution. Another neighbor whispered that Karen's parents had tried moving in with her twice before, but each time the HOA mysteriously granted them overflow privileges in someone else's house until the owners fought back. Suddenly, her midnight gate rattling wasn't just eccentric, it was a strategy. The house itself wasn't quiet on her account either. Strange drafts slipped under doors. The attic had boxes full of old newspapers, each headline gloomier than the last. Once, while tearing up the carpet, I found a trapdoor that led nowhere but to a crawlspace filled with jars. Just jars. Empty, dusty, labeled with dates in shaky handwriting. A mystery for later. For now, My real problem was the woman next door treating me like a pawn in her bizarre campaign to house her parents for free. The chapter ended with another knock, this time at a reasonable hour. I opened the door to find Karen again, clipboard at the ready. She didn't even greet me. She simply said, "My parents arrive on Thursday. The gate will be unlocked." And then she walked away, leaving me standing there in sawdust, realizing that my quiet mountain retreat was about to turn into the loudest circus I'd ever seen. The first HOA meeting I attended felt like stumbling into a satire of suburban life. It was held in the clubhouse, which looked less like a gathering space and more like a carpeted bunker from the 70s. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, folding chairs squeaked, and a hand-painted banner said Community Togetherness with the word togetherness peeling off. 15 people showed up, most with clipboards, all with grievances. I had brought a notepad, thinking I'd quietly take notes. Instead, I found myself smack in the middle of a shouting match about mailbox heights. Karen presided at the front like a dictator at a very beige United Nations. She banged a plastic gavel that cracked down the middle after the third use, but that didn't stop her from wielding it like a weapon. She listed off infractions in a tone that could sour milk. Someone's lawn gnome was too tall. Someone else's fence paint was unauthorized gloss. Then she introduced me as the new owner of the problem property on Ridge Road. Every head swiveled to look at me. I tried to smile, but Karen launched straight into the driveway issue. She announced that her parents would be arriving soon and that it was only fair the community share resources by designating certain driveways for overflow. She said mine was particularly suitable because it had good access. I raised my hand and pointed out that my driveway was part of my property, not communal parking. Karen countered that property ownership was a flexible concept within the HOA framework. I nearly laughed, but judging by the stone faces around me, this wasn't a joke. That was when I met Dave, a neighbor sitting 2 rows back who muttered just loud enough for people to hear, "Flexible concept my ass." He caught my eye, smirked, and leaned back in his chair. Later, during a break, he introduced himself. He had lived in the community for 10 years, tolerated Karen's nonsense for 9 of them, and was waiting for the day someone finally stood up to her. He shook my hand and whispered, "Don't let her bully you. The bylaws are mostly smoke and mirrors." The meeting devolved quickly. Someone proposed banning windsocks because they were distracting. Another woman argued that garden flamingos counted as wildlife violations. People yelled over each other about hedge trimming schedules. I realized then that the HOA wasn't a governing body. It was a stage where Karen thrived on drama, playing queen of rules no one else had seen written down. By the end, Karen had pushed through a motion that emergency guest accommodations could be reassigned by the HOA leadership. It passed, barely, with 3 abstentions. She turned to me, smiling like a shark, and said, "See, now it's official. Don't forget Thursday." My blood boiled, but I stayed quiet. Dave patted my shoulder as we walked out and said, "Welcome to the circus." The next few days were chaos. Workers came to fix the sagging porch, and I caught Karen standing at the edge of my driveway, timing their brakes with a stopwatch. She accused them of loitering. When I ignored her, she left flyers in my mailbox with rules about contractor conduct. Dave swung by with a 6-pack and told me not to take it personally. She tried the same thing when I had my roof replaced. She claimed the hammering was a noise violation. Thursday came faster than I wanted. Sure enough, a silver sedan pulled up behind Karen's SUV, and out stepped her parents, dragging suitcases big enough to hold bodies. Karen waved at me from the road like this was a happy family reunion. I stood at the locked gate, arms crossed. Her parents looked confused, like maybe they'd been promised a hotel stay and got my half-renovated house instead. Karen demanded I unlock the gate. I said no. She shrieked about bylaws and community spirit. I stayed firm. That night, another note appeared in my mailbox. It said, "This is only the beginning. Resistance will be futile." I almost admired the sci-fi flair. Almost. But underneath the drama, I felt the stakes rising. This wasn't just about a driveway. Karen wanted control, and she wasn't going to stop until she got it. or until someone finally shut the gate on her schemes for good. I woke up on Friday morning to find a folding chair parked in front of my gate. Sitting in it was Karen's father, wearing a fishing hat and reading the newspaper like he had been stationed there all his life. He waved at me with a casual cheerfulness that felt rehearsed. When I asked what he was doing, he said his daughter told him this was his new morning spot since the guest house was not ready yet. Guest house. I didn't have a guest house. I barely had a roof that didn't leak. When I pointed that out, he chuckled and said, "She'll work it out. She always does." Karen's mother wasn't far behind. By lunchtime, she was out in the road planting a lawn chair of her own, unpacking a thermos and sandwiches as though she were on a picnic. Cars slowed to avoid them. Neighbors slowed even more to watch. I wanted to laugh at the absurdity, but it wasn't funny when they started waving at delivery trucks, directing them toward my driveway. They acted like they already lived there, like I was the intruder. By the second day, word had spread across the community. Dave showed up shaking his head, whispering that this was the beginning of her parent plot. He explained that Karen had tried this before. Her parents had bounced between relatives, friends, and once even a rental that mysteriously burned down within 2 months. Every time, she looked for a loophole to get them settled under someone else's roof. She claimed it was temporary, just until they got back on their feet. Except back on their feet always meant putting roots into someone else's ground. That evening, I caught Karen standing on the other side of the gate with a casserole dish. She insisted it was a peace offering, a welcome gift for the new neighbors. When I reminded her that I was not her neighbor, I was the homeowner whose gate she had rattled at midnight, she gave me a look of pity, like I simply did not understand the community spirit. She tried to pass the dish through the bars. I didn't take it. It looked suspiciously like it had too much salt and too little sincerity. The following weekend, the HOA scheduled a block barbecue. I thought maybe this would be a chance to clear the air, to show I wasn't against socializing. I set aside my tools, cleaned up, and brought a stack of burgers. But the moment I arrived at the clubhouse lawn, Karen ushered her parents over like she had been waiting for her cue. They introduced themselves warmly, talking about how they looked forward to living nearby. They didn't say visiting. They didn't say staying. They said living. Karen clapped her hands and announced loudly that everyone should welcome them, as they were soon to be a permanent part of the community thanks to Ridge Road accommodations. Every eye turned to me. I nearly choked on the beer I was sipping. Dave muttered, "Here we go," and stepped closer, ready to back me up. But Karen drowned him out, spinning a tale about how I had so kindly offered to provide temporary space while renovations were ongoing. She called it a beautiful act of generosity. Her parents smiled at me, clearly believing every word. I set down my plate, cleared my throat, and told the crowd I had offered nothing, nor would I. The barbecue grew silent. Then Karen laughed awkwardly, as if I was joking, and said, "Oh, he's just modest." That was when I walked out, leaving half-cooked burgers behind. By Monday, I discovered a new problem. Someone had taped papers to my gate, documents that looked official but weren't. They had the HOA logo printed in grainy ink and claimed to authorize emergency occupancy rights for the Walker family, Karen's parents. The signatures at the bottom included names I recognized from the last meeting, but the handwriting looked suspiciously similar. Dave came by, squinted at the papers, and said, "That's Karen's handwriting, no doubt." He offered to collect witness statements, but I knew Karen thrived on technicalities. If she was forging documents, she believed she could get away with it. Things escalated when a moving truck pulled up the next day. I was sanding a window frame when I heard the rumble of tires on gravel. Karen was out front, directing the driver with wild arm gestures. Her parents stood proudly beside her, nodding at each box as though they were picking out new furniture for their future home. The driver honked, asking if the gate would be opened. Karen shouted that it was, though it clearly wasn't. When I walked down to confront them, she accused me of obstructing community property and claimed she had legal standing. I told the driver to leave. He shrugged, muttered something about crazy neighbors, and drove off. Karen screamed after him, waving her arms like she was being robbed. The fallout was immediate. She called an emergency HOA meeting. Half the community showed up, more for entertainment than allegiance. Karen launched into a tirade about how heartless I was, how my refusal to share resources was jeopardizing elderly residents' well-being. She clutched her mother's hand like a prop. She painted her father as a war veteran displaced by my selfishness. I had no proof otherwise, but the way he winked at me from his chair suggested he was enjoying the drama too much to be offended. When it was my turn to speak, I held up the forged document. I asked the group if anyone had actually signed it. Not a single hand went up. One woman gasped and said she hadn't been at the clubhouse the day her signature supposedly appeared. Another man accused Karen of trickery. She blushed crimson but doubled down, insisting she had verbal authorizations. The room buzzed with disbelief. For the first time, the tide turned. People weren't siding with her blindly. Still, Karen wasn't finished. She stomped out of the meeting, declaring that if the community wouldn't protect her parents, she would. The next morning, her parents were back in their chairs outside my gate, this time with a cooler and a radio. They waved cheerfully as though they were tailgating at a sports event. I didn't know whether to laugh or scream. By nightfall, someone had plugged in an extension cord running across the road from Karen's house to power a lamp by their chairs. It was ridiculous, almost surreal. That night, Dave came over with files he had been keeping. He revealed that Karen had a long history of bending HOA funds to her will. She had reimbursed herself for administrative costs that looked suspiciously like personal shopping receipts. She had billed the HOA for her parents' medical supplies. And now, she was using the same tactics to try and secure free housing for them under my roof. The more he showed me, the clearer it became that this wasn't just a pushy neighbor problem. It was a power grab tied to money and control. The realization shifted everything. This was no longer just about keeping unwanted guests out of my driveway. It was about exposing Karen's entire operation. If she was forging documents and siphoning funds, she could drag me into a mess much larger than a driveway dispute. And standing there in the dim light of my half-renovated living room, staring at the stack of papers Dave had laid out, I understood the stakes for the first time. I wasn't just fixing up an old mountain house anymore. I was defending it from being swallowed whole by a woman who saw it as the perfect stage for her next scheme. The chapter closed with Karen herself knocking on my door one more time. Not with casserole, not with a clipboard, but with a lawyer in tow. She smiled sweetly, as if she hadn't spent weeks harassing me, and said, "Perhaps we can come to an arrangement." It was no longer just neighborly warfare. It was legal. The knock at the door was too polite for Karen, which is how I knew it wasn't just her. I opened it to find her standing on my porch, smug as usual, and next to her was a man in a pinstripe suit holding a leather briefcase. She introduced him as her attorney, then corrected herself, saying he was the HOA's attorney. He gave me a thin smile and handed over a packet thick enough to choke a paper shredder. Inside were papers demanding that I comply with emergency accommodation statutes as set forth by the HOA leadership. I laughed out loud. He didn't. The packet accused me of obstruction, endangerment, and something called community negligence. It read less like a legal document and more like Karen's diary with bullet points. Still, the fact that she had dragged an actual lawyer onto my porch meant she was raising the stakes. I asked him if he had ever seen these so-called bylaws. He cleared his throat and admitted he was working off information provided by his client. His client being Karen, not the HOA at large. I pointed out the conflict of interest, which made him shuffle his papers nervously. Karen didn't flinch. She told me her parents would be moving into my guest house by the weekend. I reminded her again that I didn't have a guest house. She smiled and said, "Then we'll use the basement." That was the moment I realized this wasn't going to stop until I pushed back harder. Dave came over that evening, and together we flipped through the packet. He laughed at the outrageous claims but warned me not to underestimate Karen. He said she thrived on wearing people down until they gave up. Most neighbors didn't have the energy to keep fighting her, so they caved. He told me if I stood my ground, she would escalate, and sure enough, by the next day she had escalated. Her parents didn't just sit outside the gate anymore. They marched down the road with sleeping bags and set up camp like squatters at a festival. They waved at cars, offered cookies to passers-by, and made themselves the picture of innocence. To anyone who didn't know the backstory, I looked like the villain, the heartless neighbor who refused to take in a sweet elderly couple. Karen played it up, stopping joggers to explain how cruel I was, framing herself as their devoted daughter battling injustice. It was brilliant in a manipulative way, and it made my stomach churn. That afternoon, I drove into town to get supplies. When I came back, the gate was open. Not unlocked, but wide open. I jumped out of the truck and found Karen's parents dragging suitcases across my driveway. Behind them, Karen stood triumphantly with a copy of the packet waving in her hand like it was a golden ticket. I shouted, asking who had opened the gate. Her father pointed vaguely toward the road and said a helpful neighbor had done it. Dave showed up just then, swore under his breath, and helped me usher them back out. It nearly turned into a brawl, with Karen screaming about trespassing charges while simultaneously trespassing. I managed to close the gate and lock it again, but not before the parents had dropped 2 lawn chairs in the driveway, a symbolic claim to territory. 2 days later came the showdown at the emergency HOA meeting. Karen had called it specifically to address what she labeled the Ridge Road hostile occupancy crisis. She packed the clubhouse with as many allies as she could muster, bribing some with snacks, others with promises of bylaw leniency. The mood was tense, people whispering as I walked in. Dave flanked me like a bodyguard. Karen stood at the front, her parents seated dramatically on either side of her, like a courtroom drama staged in a community theater. She opened with a monologue worthy of an Oscar. She painted herself as the daughter of elderly parents with nowhere to go, vilified me as an uncaring homeowner hoarding space, and claimed the HOA bylaws granted her authority to redistribute unused accommodations. When she presented photos of her parents shivering outside my gate, the room erupted in sympathetic murmurs. Then she pulled out a spreadsheet, waving it in the air. She said the HOA's emergency fund had been used for similar cases before, citing vague line items labeled parental relief and housing stipend. That was when Dave stood up. He had brought his own stack of papers, copies of receipts and bank statements he had dug up. He handed them out to anyone willing to take one. They showed that the emergency fund had indeed been used, but almost exclusively by Karen, and suspiciously often for her parents. He pointed out that receipts for medical supplies matched purchases from a furniture store. A line item for transportation aid was actually a car lease under Karen's name. The room went silent. Karen's face tightened. She accused Dave of fabricating evidence, but too many people were already flipping through the papers, whispering. Then came the twist that shook even me. One of the older board members, usually too quiet to matter, stood up and said he had signed off on one of those transactions. He confessed Karen had told him it was for community safety, but he realized now he had been misled. Others chimed in, admitting they too had signed things without fully understanding them. Karen's house of cards was wobbling, and she knew it. Still, she didn't back down. She tried to pivot, insisting her parents' case was unique, that no one else could possibly understand the sacrifices she had made. She pointed at me, shouting that I was the enemy of compassion. Her voice cracked, desperation leaking through. Her parents sat stone-faced, sipping from water bottles, letting her do the dirty work. The climax came when Dave revealed one last document. It was a copy of a check written from the HOA account to a private vacation rental company, dated the same week Karen claimed her parents had been homeless. The implication was clear. She had pocketed community money to fund her own getaway while staging her parents as victims. Gasps rippled through the room. Even her closest allies looked unsettled. The meeting devolved into chaos. People shouted, demanded explanations. Some called for her removal from the board altogether. Karen shouted back, banging the broken plastic gavel until it split in half. She stormed out, dragging her parents with her, vowing revenge on all of us. The board voted to suspend her authority pending an investigation. It wasn't total victory, but it was the first crack in her armor. That night, back at the house, I sat on the porch with Dave. He handed me a beer, and we watched the fog roll in across the valley. For the first time, I felt like maybe the community was waking up to Karen's tricks. But I also knew she wouldn't go quietly. People like her never did. She would regroup, twist the narrative, and come back swinging. The thought should have exhausted me, but instead it steeled me. If she wanted a fight, she would get one. As if on cue, a car pulled up in the dark. Headlights swept across the trees, then went out. A door slammed. Karen's silhouette appeared at the gate. She didn't rattle it this time. She just stood there, staring at the house for a long time before turning and walking back to her car. It was quieter than her usual theatrics, and somehow that made it worse. She wasn't done. She was planning her next move, and whatever it was, I knew it would be bigger, louder, and far more dangerous than anything she had tried before. The gate stayed locked, but I slept lightly, ears tuned for the next strike. The morning after the tense standoff, I walked out onto the porch expecting to find Karen's parents in their folding chairs again, but the road was empty. The gate stood silent, locked, no casserole dishes, no forged documents taped to the bars. For a brief second, I thought maybe it was over. Maybe the board suspension had finally forced Karen into retreat. That hope lasted exactly 3 hours. Around noon, the sound of a moving van growled up the road again. This time, it wasn't Karen waving her arms. It was her parents. They were smiling ear to ear, shouting through the gate that Karen had made arrangements. I didn't even bother asking what kind. I grabbed my keys, drove down to the clubhouse, and found half the neighborhood already gathered on the lawn. Dave waved me over, holding up a piece of paper. It was a letter Karen had slipped into everyone's mailbox overnight. She claimed she was still acting president despite her suspension, that her parents were officially assigned to my property as transitional residents, and that anyone who opposed was acting against community spirit. The boldness of it left me speechless. She had been caught siphoning funds, forging documents, staging theatrics, and still she was trying to rewrite the rules. The community, however, was fed up. People who had been silent at earlier meetings were suddenly loud. They compared notes, shared stories of how Karen had meddled in their gardens, mailboxes, pets, and family events. Someone mentioned how she once fined a neighbor for hanging laundry in a way that offended property values. Another revealed she had claimed reimbursement for a hot tub under the label safety equipment. The air buzzed with anger, but also something new, solidarity. For once, the community wasn't divided between Karen's enablers and her opponents. They were all realizing they had been pawns in her game. That evening, Karen made her final move. She marched her parents straight to the gate, dragging bags behind them, and announced they were officially taking up residence in my basement. When I told her no, she accused me of harassment and threatened to call the police. For a moment, I considered letting her, just to watch the look on the officer's face when he arrived. But then I remembered the stack of documents Dave and I had gathered, and I knew we needed to end this properly. The next HOA meeting was the most packed I had ever seen. People who hadn't shown up in years crammed into the clubhouse, hungry for resolution. Karen arrived late, dragging her parents like props once again, and tried to take her usual seat at the front. She was stopped by the interim chairperson, who told her she had no authority anymore. Her face went pale, but she refused to sit down. She demanded to be heard. The room quieted, waiting. She launched into a desperate speech about family, sacrifice, and community responsibility. She painted herself as a martyr, fighting for her aging parents against a heartless, selfish newcomer. Her parents nodded solemnly, as if they were extras in a tragic play. But then Dave stood up. He had spent the past week gathering everything, every forged signature, every receipt, every suspicious reimbursement. He laid it out, page by page, for everyone to see. By the time he was done, the picture was undeniable. Karen wasn't a devoted daughter. She was a manipulator who had used her parents as shields while bleeding the community dry. The room erupted. Some people demanded she repay the funds. Others called for her removal entirely. One man even suggested pressing charges. Karen's parents looked shaken for the first time, muttering that maybe they should go back to their own house after all. Karen tried to shout them down, insisting they stay silent, but it was too late. The tide had turned, and she was standing alone in the middle of the room, surrounded by neighbors who no longer believed her stories. The vote to remove her from the board was unanimous. Even her parents abstained. She stormed out, slamming the broken gavel on the table one last time, but no one followed. Outside, she screamed threats into the night, promising lawsuits and revenge, but her voice cracked and carried less weight than ever before. When she drove away, tires squealing, no one bothered to chase her. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood changed. Without Karen policing every blade of grass, people relaxed. Kids rode bikes down the road without fear of citations. Someone put up a wind chime just to spite her, and instead of fines, there was laughter. My renovation finally gained momentum without constant interruptions. The roof was patched, the porch rebuilt, and the smell of mildew faded. Dave became a regular at the house, offering advice, sometimes just sitting on the porch with me to watch the fog roll in. One afternoon, while tearing out the last of the rotten floorboards in the living room, I found something unexpected. Underneath the boards was a small locked box, dusty and forgotten. I pried it open and found a stack of old photographs, black and white, showing the house in its earliest days. Families gathered on the porch, kids playing in the yard, neighbors smiling side by side. It struck me that this place had always been about community, long before the HOA twisted it into something else. Hidden at the bottom of the box was a letter dated nearly a century ago, from the original owner to his children, telling them to always keep the gate locked, not to shut people out, but to protect what is yours until you're ready to share it. That line stayed with me. Karen had tried to twist the idea of community into control, to blur the line between sharing and stealing. But the truth was simpler. Boundaries mattered. Respect mattered. Without those, community crumbled. On the final day of summer, the neighbors gathered again for a barbecue, this time without manipulation or hidden agendas. I brought burgers and actually got to cook them. Dave told the story of Karen's parents camping outside my gate, and everyone laughed until tears rolled down their cheeks. For once, it felt like a real neighborhood, messy but genuine, not one woman's personal fiefdom. Later that night, I locked the gate as always. The sound of the latch clicking shut felt different this time. Not defensive, not fearful, but final. The mountain air was cool, the stars sharp above the ridge, and for the first time since buying the house, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. Karen might have lost the war, but I had gained something more important. I had a home, and a community that had finally remembered how to stand together. The gate stayed locked, but my door was finally open.